Hi, welcome to our session on risk appetite, tolerance and criteria. Now, around the world, many organisations at the moment are talking about risk appetite and tolerance. And this is for a whole myriad of different reasons, but primarily because lots of regulators are asking us for risk appetite statements, and in fact in our annual reports it is now becoming the norm for us to be able to write a risk appetite statement either as a whole for our organisation or more commonly for each of those individual high-hitting risks that we might be facing as an organisation, be they potential opportunities or threats. Now, this can get really complex because every organisation tends to define and interpret risk appetite and tolerance, etc., in a different way. But to bring this down to base principles and what most of our international standards tell us, they tell us that the risk appetite is the amount of risk that we are willing to take or we're actively wanting to take as an organisation, because of course no organisation can survive without taking some risk. And then our risk tolerance talks about the amount of risk that we can take. So what is that maximum amount of risk that we can afford to take before we either go bust as an organisation or before we need to change that strategy as a whole. Now within this, sometimes it's quite nice to draw this in a diagram where we have our risk universe in which we have lots of different risks portrayed here as little dots. So this is our risk universe. Now, within that risk universe, we have a zone of appetites. Okay, so this is the amount of risk that we are willing to take. So these might be the risks that we think we might be better at managing than any of our competitors. We actively want to take those. Now, around the edge of our risk appetite, we will have a zone of tolerance. Now, those are the risks, of course, that we can take. We're not necessarily happy taking them, but we can afford to take them. And around the edge of our risk tolerance, this is where we have our risk capacity. And our capacity is that hard stop or red flag, beyond which, if we go into this zone outside of our risk tolerance, that's game over, we've gone bust, or maybe we need to change our strategy as a whole. So that is our risk capacity. So what this means is that actually our risk tolerance is actually a zone between our risk appetite and our capacity. However, many organisations call this line on the outer reaches of our tolerance the risk tolerance itself. So you can see where some of the confusion comes in. Now I've drawn our little ellipses here a bit offset for a good reason, and that's because some risks, well, we will have very, very little tolerance for. And those might be things like health and safety risks or bribery and corruption, for example. There will be other risks for which we have a much larger zone of tolerance, and they might be things like project risks, where we've intentionally incorporated quite a lot of wiggle room or contingency depending on what's going on with the project at that time. Now, we can take our appetite and tolerance and we can transfer this across into our criteria for our risk management as a whole. And our criteria can mean a number of different things, but often it is where we're trying to say, what does that risk appetite look like? What does that risk tolerance level look like as a whole? And we can begin to depict these in terms of zones of best case scenarios and also worst case scenarios. And then between those, we have our zone of capacity or tolerance. Okay, and then we have our appetite, and we can bring in metrics to say what do each of these actually look like, but then also if we were to move up and down that zone, what would these little trigger points in themselves look like? So what we're beginning to wrap together are different types of risk criteria that can often be used to compare one risk with another, depending on what that scale of impact might be on our organisational objectives. We can also use this to help us define what our key risk indicators might be, or those leading indicators, to let us understand if a risk is tracking in a good direction or in a bad direction, depending on whether it's an opportunity or threat. So this concept of risk appetite, tolerance, and then rolling in criteria is something that is very much at the forefront of risk managers' minds across all of our different organisations at the moment. And it is something that can be made incredibly complex and incredibly difficult. However, what we do during this training workshop is that we go back to basics. We say, what do we actually mean by risk appetite and tolerance? Let's take a look at lots of different tools and techniques, different facilitation techniques that we can use if we're trying to get people throughout our organisations to be able to define what these metrics or what these numbers, for example, might actually be. And then how do we embed it within our organisation, and how do we keep it up to date to make sure that the information it is giving us enables us to truly make those risk-based decisions, and also hold ourselves to account to make sure that where we've said that our capacity might be at this level, if we're operating out here, we do something immediately to bring ourselves back into our zone of tolerance again. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon.